2 tickets into the unknown are not a desertion, but a ritual of burning bridges. When the wizarding world turns into a noose, freedom is born in the silence, where old names crumble to dust, clearing the space for a love that is true. Our story begins. The rain over magical London did not fall. It oppressed. It was a relentless, vertical sheet of grey water that battered the enchanted glass of the narrow apartment windows, sounding less like weather and more like scattered handfuls of broken glass. Inside, the dim light of floating beeswax candles did little to dispel the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wool, the tooth of old parchment, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone left behind by the localized warding spells Hermione maintained with near-obsessive precision. She sat at the heavy oak table, staring at a stack of ministry reports that had ceased making sense 3 hours ago. The ink blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of holding her posture rigidly straight against the crushing atmospheric pressure of the world outside these 4 walls. Society did not rage against them anymore. It suffocated them. The stairs in the atrium, the abrupt silencing of conversations when they entered a room, the closed doors and the polite, icy dismissals. It was a slow asphyxiation, and she watched Draco breathe it in every single day. A sudden tremor passed through her fingers. She dropped her quill, her hands moving instinctively to her forearms. A frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs overtook her, her fingers tugging at the starched white linen until it lay flawlessly flat against her wrists. It was a nervous tic she had developed over the last 6 months, a physical manifestation of her desperate desire to control something, anything, in a life that felt constantly on the verge of fracturing. She waited in the quiet. The silence in the apartment wasn't peaceful. It was a physical weight, a tactile friction against her skin. She was waiting for him. When the heavy wooden door finally clicked open, there was no dramatic gust of wind, only the slow, creeping bite of a damp November night. Draco stepped over the threshold. The shadows seemed to cling to the sharp angles of his face, accentuating the hollows beneath his cheekbones and the dark, bruised exhaustion beneath his silver eyes. His black traveling cloak was heavy with rain, the water dripping silently onto the hardwood floor. He didn't look at her. He rarely looked at her immediately anymore. It was his penance, his silent, grueling punishment. He moved with a stiff, unnatural precision, shrugging off the sodden cloak. As he hung it on the iron hook by the door, Hermione watched the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the fabric, his hands entirely bloodless, the silver ring on his right hand biting harshly into his pale skin. He was locking it all away, the sneers he had undoubtedly endured at the leaky cauldron, the whispers of Death Eater that still clung to his tailored suits, no matter how perfectly pressed they were. Hermione stood, the chair scraping sharply against the floorboards. The sound echoed hollowly in the vacant space between them. The magnetic pull of him was instantaneous and overwhelming. Even now, soaked and radiating a freezing hostility born of his own self-loathing, she wanted nothing more than to cross the room and press her hands against the hard, tense line of his chest. She took a step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath her stockinged feet. "Draco," she murmured, the syllables barely louder than the rain. He flinched. It was a microscopic movement, the sudden, jarring impact of a flinch that stopped her dead in her tracks. A muscle feathered wildly along his sharp jawline. He turned his head away, his profile illuminated by a single flickering candle. The rejection was not born of malice, but of a desperate, twisted form of protection. He was pulling away, retreating into the frost, building the ice thick around his edges so she wouldn't cut herself on the broken pieces of his pride. The air in the room hummed with static, a terrible, vibrating tension that made the hairs on Hermione's arms stand on end. She held her ground, refusing to retreat, but refusing to push him further into the dark. "Are you cold?" she asked softly, wrapping her arms around her own waist. He finally turned to face her. His eyes were the colour of a winter storm, volatile and stormy, yet completely walled off. The distance between them, mere feet, felt like a gaping chasm. "No," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that betrayed how little he had spoken that evening. He moved toward the centre of the room, bringing the scent of rain and fire whiskey with him. He didn't come to her. Instead, he stopped at the opposite end of the long oak table, placing his hands flat against the scarred wood. Hermione watched the rise and fall of his shoulders under his damp shirt. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. She knew better than to ask about his evening. She knew better than to ask what Blaise or Theo had said, or what ministry official had deliberately spilled a drink on him. She merely existed in his orbit, providing a quiet anchor. Slowly, Draco reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was hesitant, almost reluctant, as if he were fighting a physical resistance. He withdrew his hand and placed 2 items gently onto the table. They were train tickets, but they were not standard ministry-issued parchment or the vibrant printed cardstock of the Hogwarts Express. They were thick, ivory vellum, the edges rough and uneven. They glowed faintly, a pulsing warm amber light that seemed to repel the shadows of the room. There was no destination printed on them, no time of departure, no train number. Only a single, intricate gold leaf insignia of a winged wheel. Hermione broke the magnetic hold of his gaze and looked down at the tickets. The faint scent of copper, ancient magic, and distance drifted up from the vellum. "What are these?" she asked, her voice tight with confusion. Draco's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "A game. Knots flat. High stakes." He spoke in clipped, fragmented sentences, his silver eyes fixed rigidly on the glowing parchment rather than her face. "I won the final hand. Zabini threw them into the pot when he ran out of galleons." Hermione traced the air above the tickets, feeling the warmth radiating from them, a soft, inviting interference against the damp cold of the apartment. "Where do they go?" "Anywhere." The words slipped from his lips, quiet and impossibly heavy. She looked up at him, her brows drawing together. "Anywhere." Draco finally lifted his gaze, meeting hers, the visceral alignment of their eyes stealing the breath from her lungs. For a fraction of a second, the icy facade cracked, revealing the raw, bleeding exhaustion underneath. "They are untethered, Hermione. Unmarked. You board the train at King's Cross, platform 7.5, and it takes you away." He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening again, the silver ring digging deeper. Away from this. Away from the whispers. Away from the ministry and the articles and the constant, unending. He stopped, his jaws snapping shut, as if he had said too much, revealed too much of the agonizing guilt he carried for dragging her down into his shadows. He immediately erected the wall again, stepping back, putting physical space between them. Or they are a complete fraud, a parlor trick Zabini bought off a street vendor in Nocturne Alley. Throw them in the fire. He turned on his heel, moving toward the dark hallway that led to their bedroom, his posture stiff, shutting her out completely. It was the pattern, the approach, the terrifying vulnerability, and then the violent, immediate repulsion. "Wait," Hermione commanded. It wasn't a request, it was a spell in itself. Draco halted, his back to her, his shoulders tense. Hermione looked around the apartment. She looked at the towering stacks of files, the meticulously organized calendar of ministry galas she was expected to attend alone, the defensive wards she spent hours maintaining so no one could hex their door in the night. She looked at the life she had built, a life of relentless, exhausting defiance. And then she looked at the man standing in the hallway, the man who had fought a war within his own soul, who had chosen her against the dictates of his blood, who was currently drowning in silence because he believed he was a stain on her pristine reputation. She didn't straighten her cuffs this time. She picked up the thick, glowing vellum. The magic hummed against her skin, a warm, vibrating promise. "When does it leave?" she asked to his rigid back. Draco turned his head slowly, looking at her over his shoulder. The dim candlelight caught a flicker of something deeply desperate in his eyes. Midnight. The platform seals at midnight. Hermione glanced at the ornate clock above the mantelpiece. It was 11:15. She didn't hesitate. She didn't weigh the logic, or draft a leave of absence for the minister, or consider the scandal. She simply moved. "We have 45 minutes to pack," she said, her voice entirely devoid of its usual trembling anxiety. It was clear, bright, and utterly certain. Draco turned fully around, staring at her as if she were a complicated arithmancy equation he couldn't solve. He opened his mouth, the instinct to argue, to tell her she was being foolish, to remind her of her career, clearly warring on his tongue. He took a breath to push her away again. Hermione crossed the room, stepping directly into his personal space, breaking through the static and the frost. She didn't touch him, knowing he might flinch, but she stood close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his wet clothes. "Don't," she whispered fiercely, staring up into his shocked silver eyes. "Don't tell me to stay. Don't tell me it's a mistake. Pack a bag, Draco." For a long, suspended moment, the air between them pulled tight, a delicate thread stretched to its absolute limit. The only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain against the glass and the erratic, thudding rhythm of her own heart. He stared down at her, the mask slipping completely, leaving only the shattered, beautiful reality of a man who desperately wanted to surrender. He gave a single, jerky nod. The next 40 minutes passed in a blur of silent, frantic magic. Trunks were summoned. Essentials were folded and shrunk with sharp flicks of their wands. They moved around each other in the bedroom, a choreographed dance of avoidance and agonizing awareness. Every time they passed, the magnetic pull flared, a rush of atmospheric pressure that made Hermione's breath hitch, but neither reached out. The tension was a living thing in the room with them. At 11:50, they stood by the front door. The trunks were shrunken and tucked into Draco's coat pocket. Hermione wore a heavy burgundy travelling cloak, her wand secured in her sleeve. She looked back at the apartment. She left the candles burning. She left the ministry reports scattered on the table. She left her meticulous, heavily guarded life exactly where it was. Draco reached for the heavy brass doorknob. He paused, his hand hovering over the metal. He looked down at Hermione, his expression unreadable in the shadows, but the tension radiating from his frame was palpable. He was giving her one last chance to step back, one last silent opportunity to save herself from him. Hermione reached out, deliberately bypassing the doorknob, and wrapped her hand firmly around his wrist. The tactile friction of her warm palm against his icy skin caused a sharp intake of breath to hiss through his teeth. She squeezed, anchoring him, grounding him. "Open the door, Draco," she said softly. His fingers curled tightly around the brass. With a heavy, echoing click, he turned the knob, and they stepped out into the crushing, blinding downpour of the London night, leaving the door wide open behind them. The rain did not merely fall. It aggressively sought to extinguish the lingering warmth of their skin as they plunged into the alleyway. The darkness swallowed them whole, the only illumination coming from the sporadic, sickly yellow flare of the Muggle street lamps bleeding through the downpour. Draco's hand remained rigidly wrapped around her forearm. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute, a tether of cold leather and tense muscle. Before Hermione could draw a full breath of the petrichor-heavy air, the world twisted. Sidelong apparition was always an uncomfortable, squeezing sensation, but tonight it felt like being pulled through the eye of a needle forged from ice. The jarring impact of their arrival behind a rusted dumpster near King's Cross Station sent a tremor through Hermione's knees. She stumbled, her boots scraping sharply against the slick, oil-stained concrete. Instinctively, Draco caught her. His arm banded around her waist, pulling her flush against the wet, heavy wool of his cloak. For one suspended second, the kinetic hum of his magic bled into hers. She could feel the erratic, heavy thud of his heart against her ribs, a stark betrayal of the detached, aristocratic mask he wore. The physical proximity was a sudden, blinding flare in the dark. Then, just as rapidly, the repulsion came. He released her as if the contact burned, stepping back so quickly his heel caught on a discarded bottle, sending it shattering into the gloom. He didn't offer a word of apology. He simply turned his face away, the sharp line of his jaw tight enough to crack bone, pulling the shadows around himself like a shroud. "We have 12 minutes, he stated, his voice devoid of inflection, staring fixedly at the towering, floodlit facade of the station. Hermione swallowed the lump of hurt that rose in her throat. She understood the mechanics of his withdrawal, the deep, unvoiced conviction that his touch corrupted her. But understanding it didn't make the sudden freezing of his demeanor any less agonizing. She adjusted the strap of her beaded bag, the tiny beads clicking together with a hollow echo that sounded deafening in the heavy, wet air. "Lead the way," she replied, matching his flat tone. They moved in tandem through the vast, echoing concourse of King's Cross. The station was a cavernous expanse of wrought iron and polished stone, nearly abandoned at this hour, save for a few weary Muggle travellers asleep on hard wooden benches. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a grating, artificial static, casting pale, sickly shadows across the tiled floors. Every step they took amplified the distance between them. Draco walked half a pace ahead, his posture impossibly straight, a dark, commanding silhouette parting the emptiness. Hermione watched the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his wand hand remained perfectly still at his side, ready to draw at the slightest provocation. He was entirely on guard, expecting an ambush, expecting the world to punish them for daring to exist in the open. They bypassed platforms 9 and 10, moving further into the older, less illuminated sections of the station. Here, the scent of stale coffee and damp newsprint faded, replaced by the deep metallic bite of iron dust and the faint, unmistakable ozone scent of old wards. Between platforms 7 and 8, a thick pillar of soot-stained brick stood in shadow. Draco halted abruptly. He turned to face the solid masonry, his chest heaving once, deeply, before he went perfectly still. Hermione stopped beside him, careful to leave a gap of air between their sleeves. The atmospheric pressure around them spiked, thick and difficult to breathe. He withdrew the 2 tickets from his inner pocket. In the dim light of the station, the vellum pulsed with a warmer, brighter amber glow, reacting to the proximity of the barrier. Draco stared at the tickets, then slowly turned his head to look at her. His silver eyes were stripped of their usual guarded frost. Instead, they held a stark, hollow terror. It was the look of a man standing on the edge of a precipice, realizing he was about to pull the only light in his life down into the abyss with him. "Hermione," he breathed, the word rough and fractured. It was a warning, a plea. She met his gaze, refusing to let her own chin tremble. She knew what he was doing. He was building the final wall. He was going to tell her to go home, to return to her safe, respected life, to leave the tarnished Death Eater to his cursed exile. "Don't," she interrupted, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper. She stepped closer, invading his space, daring him to retreat. The tactile friction of the air between them grew dense, heavy with unspoken pleas. "We left the door open, Draco. We don't look back." His jaw locked. "You don't know what you're throwing away." "I know exactly what I am leaving," she countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce heat. "I am leaving a cage. Now, are we going through this wall, or are you going to stand here and let the clock strike midnight?" A muscle feathered frantically at his temple. The internal war raged visible across his pale features. For a moment, she thought he might actually turn and walk away. But then, with a sharp, ragged exhale, he reached out. He didn't take her hand. Instead, his long fingers curled around the fabric of her sleeve, gripping the damp burgundy wool with a desperation that bordered on violence. "Together," he gritted out. "Together," she echoed, her heart soaring into her throat. They stepped forward as one. The solid brick dissolved into a rush of icy wind and a blinding, localized darkness. It lasted only a fraction of a second before their boots hit the wooden planks of a hidden platform. The transition was jarring. The grating, fluorescent hum of the Muggle station vanished, replaced by the deep, rhythmic chugging of a massive, midnight blue locomotive. Steam billowed across the platform, thick and carrying the rich scent of burning pine and molten brass. There were no ministry officials, no whispering crowds, no prying eyes. The platform was completely, blissfully empty. The train itself was a masterpiece of archaic magic. intricate silver filigree laced the dark iron of the carriages, and the windows glowed with a soft, inviting golden light. A single door stood open near the center of the train, a wrought iron step lowered in silent invitation. Draco finally released her sleeve. His hand fell to his side, his fingers twitching slightly before he curled them into a fist. The intense magnetic pull between them remained, a physical tether that seemed to tighten the further they moved from London. Without a word, he gestured toward the open door. Hermione climbed the step, her boots clicking softly on the brass threshold. The interior of the carriage was lined with dark mahogany and plush midnight blue velvet. It smelled faintly of old parchment and cedarwood, a scent so profoundly comforting that her shoulders instantly dropped a fraction of an inch. Draco followed her inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The lock engaged with a loud final clack. They found an empty compartment near the end of the car. The seats were deep and inviting, lit by a single wrought iron sconce that cast dancing shadows across the panelled walls. Hermione took a seat by the window, while Draco took the opposite bench, choosing the corner closest to the door. He immediately stiffened, his eyes scanning the empty luggage racks, the velvet curtains, the polished floorboards. He was searching for traps, his mind unable to comprehend the sudden absence of hostility. A loud, resonant whistle tore through the quiet night. The floorboards beneath them gave a sudden, shuddering lurch, and the train began to move. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels on the tracks started as a slow, deliberate heartbeat, gradually accelerating as they slipped away from the hidden platform and out into the vast, unknown darkness of the countryside. Hermione leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the blurred, rainy lights of London begin to recede. The tension in the compartment did not dissipate. Rather, it transformed. It was no longer the suffocating, oppressive weight of society's judgment. It was an insular, vibrating static, born entirely of their proximity. They were alone, truly, utterly alone, sealed inside a carriage hurtling toward an unknown destination. She turned her head to look at him. Draco had tilted his head back against the velvet upholstery, his eyes closed. The harsh overhead lighting caught the sheer exhaustion etched into his features, the dark circles, the pale, drawn skin. Yet, even in rest, he looked like a tightly coiled spring, a man waiting for the next blow to fall. Hermione didn't speak. She let the silence stretch, allowing the rhythmic sway of the train to rock the remaining adrenaline from her veins. She watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, feeling the magnetic pull tugging at her center, a quiet, insistent demand. The space between their knees was less than 2 feet, a chasm of unspoken words and buried fears, waiting for the long night ahead. The rhythmic, hypnotic thud of the iron wheels over the ancient tracks became a relentless metronome for the passing hours. Outside the frosted glass of their compartment, the storm continued to rage, though it no longer felt like a deliberate punishment from the sky. It was merely a chaotic backdrop to the vibrating static trapped within the small, velvet-lined space. Hermione watched the condensation trace erratic, glistening paths down the dark window pane. The reflection of the single wrought iron sconce flickered over the glass, superimposing a warm, dancing amber light over the bleak, rushing darkness of the unknown countryside. Across from her, Draco had not moved for what felt like an eternity. His eyes remained firmly shut, but the rigid, unforgiving line of his spine against the mahogany panelling betrayed his wakefulness. His pale hands rested flat on his thighs, the fabric of his dark trousers pulled taut beneath his grip. She tracked the microscopic movements of his fingers, a slight, involuntary twitch of the index finger, the slow, agonizing curl into a loose fist, and then the deliberate, forced relaxing of the tendons. He was fighting an invisible, excruciating war, the heavy atmospheric pressure of his own guilt pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush his ribs. He believed he had stolen her, kidnapped the brightest witch of her age from her rightful pedestal, and dragged her into the shadows of an unmarked train heading to nowhere. The temperature in the carriage began to plummet steadily as they climbed higher into unseen terrain. The ambient magic that usually warmed wizarding transport seemed purposefully absent, leaving them at the mercy of the November night. Hermione shivered, her teeth clicking together once before she clamped her jaw tightly shut. She desperately did not want to disturb the fragile, crystalline silence. She rubbed her palms along her forearms, the coarse friction of the damp burgundy wool doing little to ward off the encroaching chill that was settling deep into her marrow. The tiny rustle of her shifting was enough. Draco's silver eyes snapped open. They were entirely lucid, stripped of the heavy fatigue that had plagued him in their London apartment, replaced by a hyper-vigilant, almost feral intensity. He registered her shivering instantly. The sharp muscle in his jaw worked, flexing beneath his pale skin. Without a single word, he leaned forward, breaking his self-imposed quarantine. The magnetic pull of his sudden physical proximity stole the breath straight from Hermione's lungs, the air between them turning thick and heavy with unspoken intent. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements agonizingly slow, deliberately telegraphing his intent so she wouldn't flinch away. He withdrew his wand, hawthorn, dark and lethal-looking in the dim, flickering light. A sharp, precise flick of his wrist, and a silent incantation sent a wave of localized, ember-warm magic wrapping around her shoulders like a heavy, unseen blanket. The distinct scent of sandalwood, sharp ozone, and old parchment flared in the small space, his signature magical resonance settling intimately over her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough and quiet, swallowed quickly by the clatter of the tracks. He did not acknowledge the gratitude. He immediately leaned back, retreating into his corner, snapping the physical distance between them taut once more. "You should sleep, Granger. We have no idea when this infernal contraption will finally stop or where it will dump us." Using her surname. It was a calculated, defensive retreat, a shield forged of absolute ice to keep her at a safe distance. The sudden drop in emotional temperature was a jarring impact, a violent shift from the warmth of his magic to the freezing absolute of his demeanor. "I can't sleep," she replied, refusing to look away, refusing to let him hide in the shadows he so desperately craved. "The wards. I haven't cast any protective enchantments on the door." "They are unnecessary here," he cut in, his tone biting, though the severity was entirely betrayed by the anxious tremor in his fingers as he obsessively adjusted his silver cufflinks. "You aren't in London anymore. No one is tracking us. No one cares enough to follow a disgraced Malfoy onto a ghost train in the middle of the night." The self-deprecation was a jagged, rusted edge. Hermione felt a sudden, bright flare of protective anger burn away the lingering cold in her veins. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, mirroring his earlier posture, deliberately invading the neutral territory between their velvet benches. The space between their knees narrowed to mere inches. "Stop doing that," she demanded softly, the quiet intensity of her tone cutting through the mechanical noise of the train. "Doing what?" His gaze flicked sharply to the window, deliberately avoiding the visceral alignment of their eyes. He stared at the dark glass as if the answers to his internal torment were written in the rain. "Punishing yourself. Punishing me by proxy." He let out a harsh, breathless sound that was completely devoid of any humor. The facade cracked, the aristocratic mask shattering to reveal the exhausted, desperate man beneath. "I pulled you out of your life, Hermione. Look at you. You are shivering in a drafty, ancient compartment, running blindly away from a society that would have crowned you Minister for Magic in a decade. And why? All because you are too stubborn to admit that I am a sinking ship, dragging you into the dark. I chose to pack my bag." She countered fiercely, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. "I chose to walk out that door with you. You didn't cast an imperious curse on me, Draco. You didn't force my hand." "I might as well have," he snarled, finally snapping his head back to look at her. The sheer, naked desperation in his storm-colored eyes was devastating. It was a torrential flood of suppressed agony. "My mere existence in your orbit suffocates you. You spend your nights warding our door against people who hate the very sight of me. You spend your days at the ministry defending a ghost to people who will never look at me and see anything other than a dark mark. I am ruining you, and I am too utterly selfish to let you go." The air between them thickened exponentially, the static turning into a volatile, crackling energy that made the hairs on the back of Hermione's neck stand on end. She didn't pause to weigh the consequences. She simply reacted to the bleeding wound in front of her. She crossed the narrow gap between the seats, dropping to her knees on the polished floorboards directly between his parted legs. Draco inhaled sharply, a violent, full-body shudder racking his frame as she invaded his immediate, heavily guarded space. He pressed himself back against the velvet upholstery, the fabric groaning under his weight, but there was nowhere left to retreat. He was cornered by her sheer presence. She reached up, her hands hovering mere millimeters from his face. She could feel the icy radiation of his skin, the frantic, erratic pulse beating visibly at the base of his throat. He stared down at her, his pupils blown wide, eclipsing the silver. His hands remained frozen on his thighs, the hawthorn wand slipping from his loosened grip to clatter softly, ignored against the wooden floor. "You are not a ghost," she whispered, her voice trembling with the sheer, undeniable force of her conviction. "You are real, and you are mine. I am not running away from my life. I am running toward ours." Slowly, she bridged the final agonizing gap. She pressed her palms flat against his sharp cheekbones. The tactile friction of her warm skin against his cold, tense face drew a raw, broken sound from the back of his throat. It was the sound of a man starving for warmth, yet entirely terrified of incinerating the source. He closed his eyes, his heavy head dropping forward into her hands, surrendering to the physical anchor she provided. His own hands hovered in the air beside her hips, trembling violently, caught in a torturous limbo between the ingrained instinct to push her away and the desperate, crushing need to pull her flush against his chest. Slowly, with agonizing hesitation, his long fingers brushed the heavy wool at the sides of her waist. The mere contact was electric, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated fire straight down her spine. The tremor in his touch was a confession in itself. He opened his eyes, the silver liquid and burning as he looked at her mouth. The distance between their lips was an atmospheric pressure ready to combust. Then, the train gave a sudden, violently jarring lurch. A loud, piercing mechanical screech echoed aggressively through the undercarriage, throwing them both instantly off balance. The glowing amber light of the wrought iron sconce flickered violently, hissed, and died, plunging the small compartment into absolute, suffocating pitch-black darkness, just as the heavy iron brakes began to scream against the tracks. The sudden, violent deceleration threw the world into chaos. The pitch-black darkness was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that amplified the aggressive screeching of the iron brakes beneath the floorboards. Hermione felt the floor drop beneath her, gravity betraying her balance. But before her knees could strike the polished mahogany, an arm banded around her waist like a vice of solid steel. The jarring impact of her shoulder against his chest was cushioned only by the thick, damp wool of his coat. Draco had moved with the lethal, ingrained speed of a seeker, ripping himself from his corner to intercept her fall. In the absolute, suffocating dark, the sensory input was overwhelming. She could smell the sharp, metallic tang of his adrenaline interwoven with the deep, grounding scent of sandalwood, ozone, and the faint, bitter ghost of fire whiskey. The tactile friction of his leather-clad fingers gripping her hip sent a searing electric jolt through her heavy burgundy cloak, anchoring her against the violent shuddering of the carriage. His chest heaved against her cheek, his heartbeat an erratic, frantic drumbeat echoing against her ear. For 3 long, suspended seconds, as the train groaned to a final, agonizing halt, he held her flush against him. He was a shield, a rigid, unyielding barrier between her and the unseen dark. Then, the mechanical roaring ceased, replaced by the hollow, ringing quiet of a stationary train. Instantly, the protective tension in his frame snapped into a different, much colder kind of rigidity. He released her waist, as though the fabric of her cloak had suddenly turned to molten iron. He stepped back so hastily that his boot caught the edge of the opposite bench with a dull, echoing thud. "Lumos," he muttered, his voice a harsh, fractured rasp that scraped against the silence. The pale, sterile light of his hawthorn wand flared, throwing stark, elongated shadows against the panelled walls. He was already turning away from her, his free hand raking violently through his white blonde hair, ruining its immaculate, aristocratic perfection. His chest was still rising and falling far too rapidly. He refused to look at her, fixing his volatile silver gaze on the frosted glass of the window, though the darkness outside offered absolutely no reflection. He was retreating again, rebuilding the walls of ice that her proximity had threatened to melt. "Gather your things," he instructed, the gravel in his tone failing to mask the faint tremor in his fingers as he aggressively straightened the cuffs of his shirt. "We're leaving the carriage." Hermione did not argue. The atmospheric pressure in the small compartment had shifted from a crackling magnetic pull to a sharp, freezing static. She picked up her beaded bag, the tiny glass beads clicking together with a hollow sound that seemed deafening in the heavy quiet. Draco moved past her, ensuring a careful, deliberate gap of air remained between their shoulders. He pushed the heavy iron door of the compartment open, stepping out into the narrow corridor. Hermione followed, her boots silent on the velvet runner. When he threw open the exterior door of the train, there was no localized gust of damp wind. There was no aggressive, freezing rain. Instead of the suffocating, waterlogged misery of London, the air that rushed into the carriage was shockingly crisp. It carried the dry, sun-baked memory of terracotta, the sweet, herbaceous perfume of wild mountain thyme, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of blooming night jasmine. The oppressive weight that had pressed against Hermione's lungs for the past 6 months evaporated in an instant, leaving a strange, dizzying lightness in its wake. She stepped out onto the wrought iron threshold and looked up. The sky above was not a low ceiling of oppressive grey smog, but a sweeping, vast canvas of deep indigo, punctured by thousands of brilliant, diamond-sharp stars. There was no light pollution, no magical exhaust from a sprawling city. They had stopped at a small, weathered wooden platform that looked as though it hadn't borne the weight of a passenger in a century. Beyond it lay a cobblestone path winding down into a slumbering, hidden valley. Draco stepped down onto the wooden planks first. His wand was raised, the tip glowing with a lethal, bright intensity. His silver eyes swept the perimeter, dissecting the shadows cast by the ancient, twisted olive trees that lined the platform. The muscle in his jaw feathered rapidly. He was a coiled spring, entirely hyper-vigilant. He was looking for the trap. He expected ministry auras to step from the tree line. He expected the blinding flash of a reporter's camera. He expected the world to demand its pound of flesh. When he found nothing but the gentle rustle of leaves in the night breeze and the distant, rhythmic chirping of cicadas, the tension in his shoulders did not ease. It simply morphed into a dangerous, volatile confusion. The absolute absence of a threat was a language he no longer knew how to speak. Hermione stepped down beside him. The wooden planks groaned softly beneath her boots. She looked down at her hands. The 2 vellum tickets she had been clutching pulsed brightly one last time, emitting a warm amber flare. Then the parchment curled in on itself, transfiguring with a soft hissing sound into a heavy wrought iron key. Attached to the loop was a smooth wooden tag etched with a single elegant number, Quatre. Behind them, the massive midnight blue locomotive issued a low, mournful whistle that vibrated deep in Hermione's chest. Slowly, without a single mechanical jolt, the train began to glide forward along the ancient tracks. As it moved, the dark iron and polished brass began to dissolve, bleeding into a thick, silvery mist until there was nothing left but the empty rail line and the quiet, fragrant night. Their only connection to London had literally evaporated into thin air. Draco stared at the empty space where the train had been, his wand arm dropping incrementally to his side. The stark reality of their isolation was settling over him. "Come," he said abruptly, turning on his heel. He didn't wait for her to agree, his long strides eating up the distance as he began to walk down the sloping cobblestone path toward the valley. Hermione followed, her gaze tracing the rigid, unyielding line of his back. The village below was a masterpiece of rustic, magical architecture. Small, sturdy cottages built from pale, sun-bleached stone clung to the gentle slopes of the hills. Heavy wooden shutters were drawn tight against the night, but faint, warm light leaked from the cracks, casting long, golden lines across the uneven streets. The air grew thicker with the scent of sweet hay, rich, overturned soil, and the unmistakable earthy musk of livestock. There were no whispers here. There were no stares, no cold dismissals, no ministry edicts. There was only the hollow echo of their footsteps on the ancient stones, a rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat, syncing with the deep, slumbering magic of the earth itself. Yet, Draco walked as though he were navigating a minefield. His posture was military, his gaze darting to every dark alleyway, every shadowed doorway. He was deliberately constructing an invisible fortress around himself, terrified that the moment he allowed himself to breathe this clean, lavender-scented air, the illusion would shatter and the cruelty of their reality would drag them back into the dark. They found the cottage marked with the number 4 at the very edge of the village, where the cobblestones gave way to a sprawling meadow of wild grasses. It was a modest, beautiful structure. Thick vines of wisteria clung to the pale masonry, the dormant branches twisting intricately around the heavy oak door. Draco stepped up to the threshold. He hesitated, his pale fingers gripping the wrought iron key Hermione had handed him. He stared at the brass lock, a sudden, violent tremor shaking his hand. To unlock this door was to accept the sanctuary, to admit that they had actually escaped. And accepting sanctuary meant he had no more external enemies to fight. Only the internal demons that told him he was unworthy of standing in the light beside her. Hermione moved to stand beside him. The magnetic pull flared, a quiet, insistent warmth in the cool night air. She didn't speak. She simply stood in his orbit, offering her silent, steadfast presence. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet. With a sharp, decisive movement, he thrust the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, heavy click. The ancient warding magic rippled over the oak, recognizing them not as pariahs, but as rightful inhabitants. The door swung open, revealing an interior that was bathed in the soft, dying embers of a massive stone hearth. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling of dried apples, beeswax, and old polished wood. To the left, a small rustic kitchen area boasted a heavy butcher block table. Straight ahead, through a wide, curved archway, lay the bedroom. A single, massive four-poster bed dominated the space, covered in a thick, hand-stitched quilt. Hermione stepped over the threshold, pulling her heavy burgundy cloak from her shoulders. The relief was instantaneous, a physical unwinding of the tight coils in her spine. She dropped her beaded bag onto a woven rug, the sound dull and muffled. Draco, however, did not follow her in. He remained standing in the doorway, a dark, sharp phantom lingering on the precipice. The pale moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the profound exhaustion and the deeply entrenched fear in his eyes. He watched her inhabit the warm, fragrant space, and the sheer contrast between her bright, undeniable life and his dark, suffocating guilt was a physical interference he couldn't bridge. Slowly, agonizingly, he stepped inside and pushed the heavy oak door shut. The lock engaged with a final resonant thud, sealing them in. he did not remove his wet coat. He bypassed the inviting warmth of the hearth and moved toward a rigid, high-backed wooden chair tucked into the furthest, darkest corner of the main room. He sat down stiffly, his back perfectly straight, his wand resting on his knee. "Take the bed, Granger," he commanded. His voice was a flat, icy void, completely devoid of the raw desperation he had shown on the train. It was a masterful, devastating retreat into the Malfoy armor. "I will keep watch." Hermione stopped in the center of the room. The friction of their contrasting states, her desperate need for connection, his violent need for isolation, made the air crackle. She looked at him, sitting in the shadows, choosing the cold, choosing the discomfort, deliberately punishing himself for the perceived sin of bringing her here. "There is no one to watch for, Draco," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying a core of absolute, unyielding steel. "The wards recognized us. We are safe." "You don't know that," he countered instantly, his silver eyes flashing in the gloom. "The perimeter is exposed. The magic here is archaic, undocumented. We have no idea who—" "The perimeter is a field of wild lavender," she interrupted, taking a deliberate step toward him. He flinched back, pressing his shoulders harder into the wooden chair. "Stay there." Hermione ignored the command. She crossed the room, the floorboards silent beneath her stockinged feet. She stopped mere inches from his knees, invading his carefully constructed isolation. The magnetic pull was a physical weight now, a heavy, desperate gravity demanding to be acknowledged. She slowly sank to her knees, positioning herself directly in front of him. Draco's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair, his knuckles entirely bloodless. She reached out, extending her hands toward his chest. He recoiled slightly, but there was nowhere left to run. Her fingers brushed the heavy, damp wool of his coat lapels. The tactile friction was immediate and intense. She felt the violent, suppressed tremor racking his chest, the physical manifestation of a man tearing himself apart from the inside out. Slowly, deliberately, she grasped the top button of his coat. "Take off the armor," she whispered, looking up through the shadows to meet his volatile, storm-colored eyes. Draco's right hand snapped up, moving with blinding speed. His long fingers wrapped around her wrist in an iron grip, halting her movement entirely. The contact burned. His skin was freezing, but the pulse beating frantically against her palm was pure, volatile fire. He stared down at her, his jaw locked, his eyes wide with a staggering, naked vulnerability. He was trapped in the agonizing space between begging her to let him keep his protective walls and dying for her to tear them down completely. The grip on Hermione's wrist was not a gesture of aggression, but the desperate, clawing hold of a drowning man. Draco's fingers were like ice-cold iron, yet through the tactile friction of his skin against hers, she felt the violent, chaotic vibration of his pulse. It was the rhythm of a man pushed to his absolute limit, a man whose internal conflicts had finally outgrown the silence of his aristocratic cage. For a long, suspended minute, neither of them moved. The only sound in the small stone cottage was the crackle of the dying embers in the hearth and the ragged, shallow breaths Draco drew into his lungs. The atmospheric pressure in the room had shifted, thickening into something visceral and heavy, like the air before a catastrophic lightning strike. "Don't," he choked out. The word was fractured, a shard of glass in the quiet. "Hermione, don't. You don't understand the weight of what you're doing. If you pull me out of this dark, there's nothing left to protect you from what I am." Hermione didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she leaned into the pressure of his grip, using the connection to anchor herself. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering, even as the shadows cast by his sharp cheekbones made him look like a haunting apparition of the boy he had once been. "I am not a glass sculpture, Draco," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through his frantic energy. "I don't need a protector who is hiding behind a mask of ice. I need you, here, present." Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing patience, she moved her other hand. She didn't touch his skin this time. She reached for the silver buttons of his damp traveling coat. One by one, she began to undo them. The metallic snip of each button sliding through its hole was the only punctuation in the heavy silence. Draco's hand on her wrist tightened. Then suddenly, his fingers went limp. His arm dropped to the side of the wooden chair, his hand dangling uselessly, trembling with the sheer force of his internal struggle. He let his head fall back against the high wooden slats of the chair, his eyes closing as a shuddering exhale escaped his lips. It was a surrender, a total, devastating collapse of his defenses. She pushed the heavy wool from his shoulders. It fell to the floor in a sodden, dark heap, leaving him in only his white linen shirt. The thin fabric did nothing to hide the sharp, defensive line of his collarbones, or the way his chest heaved in a desperate attempt to regulate his breathing. Without the armor of the Malfoy tailoring, he looked raw, emotionally broken, and impossibly fragile. Hermione stood up, her knees cracking softly in the quiet. She didn't retreat. She reached out and placed her palms flat against his chest, right over his heart. The warmth of her skin bled through the linen, a sudden, bright interference against the chill he had been carrying since London. Draco's eyes snapped open. They were no longer silver storms. They were wide, dark pools of raw, unadulterated need. He reached out, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and gripped her waist. He didn't pull her closer, but he held on as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that had suddenly lost its gravity. "You're here," he whispered, the realization sounding like a confession of a sin. "You're actually here with me." "I told you," she murmured, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I'm running toward our life, Draco, not away from mine." The tension between them, that invisible, magnetic pull that had been stretching tighter and tighter since they boarded the train, finally reached its breaking point. Draco pulled her forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. He didn't kiss her. He simply leaned into her, his forehead resting against her shoulder, his hands clutching the back of her burgundy cloak, as if he were afraid she might evaporate into the French night air. Hermione wrapped her arms around his head, her fingers tangling in the soft, cool silk of his white blonde hair. She held him as the silence of the village settled over them, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the quiet promise of a beginning. The night outside deepened, the scent of lavender and ozone drifting through the cracks in the stone walls. In this hidden corner of the world, the ghosts of their past had no voices. There were no marks, no bloodlines, no wars. There was only the tactile friction of two souls trying to remember how to breathe without a weight on their chests. Eventually, Draco pulled back just enough to look at her. The moonlight through the window caught a single, glistening track of moisture on his cheek, a rare, silent admission of the grief he was finally letting go. "I won't be able to give you the world you deserve, Hermione," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual gravelly depth, though the ice was gone. "I can only give you this quiet, this nothingness." Hermione smiled, a small, weary but genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "Draco, for the first time in my life, nothingness sounds like everything." She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the bite of his silver ring pressing against her skin, a reminder of who he was, but no longer a threat. She led him toward the wide, curved archway of the bedroom. The heavy, hand-stitched quilt on the bed looked like a sanctuary. As they lay down, fully clothed and exhausted beyond measure, the rhythmic swaying of the train seemed to linger in their bones. Draco pulled her into his side, his arm a protective bar across her waist. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into the frost. He held her flush against him, their heartbeats eventually finding a slow, synchronous rhythm that matched the slumbering magic of the valley outside. The morning arrived not with the harsh grey glare of London, but with a soft, golden intrusion of light through the gaps in the heavy wooden shutters. It brought with it the sound of distant, rhythmic bells, clear, melodic notes that danced on the crisp morning air. Hermione stirred, the warmth of the quilt and the solid, radiating heat of the man beside her, making her feel heavier and more grounded than she had in years. She opened her eyes to find Draco already awake. He was propped up on one elbow, his silver eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that was almost unnerving. The shadows beneath his eyes were still there, but the volatile, haunted look had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative stillness. "The bells," he said, his voice a low morning rasp. "I think the locals are awake." Hermione sat up, pushing her wild curls back from her face. "We should probably see where anywhere actually is." They moved with a strange, hesitant domesticity, the silence between them now filled with a budding curiosity rather than the sharp static of conflict. Draco reclaimed his wand from the floor of the main room, but he didn't tuck it into his sleeve with the usual paranoid haste. He left it on the butcher block table as they stepped out into the morning sun. The village was transformed in the light. The pale stone cottages glowed with a buttery warmth, and the wisteria on their walls was a vibrant, sleeping green. The air was intoxicatingly fresh, smelling of wood smoke and fresh goat's milk. As they walked down toward the center of the village, they saw the inhabitants. These were not the fashionable, guarded wizards of Diagon Alley. They wore sturdy, homespun robes in earthy tones, their faces lined with sun and laughter. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that felt entirely alien to the frantic pace of London. In the center of the village square, a large stone fountain bubbled with clear water. Around it, a group of villagers were gathered, tending to a flock of small, spirited goats with silver-grey fur and intelligent, glowing eyes. A man with a thick, salt-and-pepper beard and a wide straw hat looked up as they approached. He didn't sneer. He didn't look for a dark mark. He simply leaned on his wooden staff and gave them a slow, welcoming nod. "Bonjour," the man said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "You are the ones from the midnight train. Apartment Quatre. Draco stepped forward, his posture instinctively straightening into its aristocratic lines, but he caught himself. He glanced at Hermione, then back at the man. Yes, we arrived last night. The man chuckled, a warm, grounding sound. I am Henri. Welcome to Saint-Sulpice-des-Chèvres. You look like you have come from a place with too much rain and too many secrets. Draco's mouth twitched, not a smirk, but a genuine, fleeting shadow of a smile. He looked at the goats, one of which had wandered over to sniff curiously at the hem of his pristine white shirt. The creature let out a sharp, indignant bleat and tried to nibble on his cufflink. Something like that, Draco replied. He reached down, his long, elegant fingers hesitating before he tentatively scratched the goat behind its ears. The animal leaned into his touch, its tail wagging with frantic enthusiasm. Hermione watched him, the sight of Draco Malfoy, scion of the most prestigious pureblood house in Britain, standing in a dusty French square, being accosted by a magical goat, making a bubble of hysterical, happy laughter rise in her throat. It's a quiet life here, Henry continued, watching them with keen, kind eyes. We grow our herbs, we make our cheese, and we tend our flocks. The magic here is in the soil, not in the ministry. Draco looked up, his gaze sweeping over the sun-drenched valley, the ancient olive trees, and the peaceful, bustling village. A strange, far-off look entered his eyes, a look of a man seeing a dream he hadn't dared to name out loud. A goat farmer, Draco murmured, almost to himself. Hermione stepped closer to him, her shoulder brushing his. What was that? Draco turned to her, and for the first time, the light in his eyes was entirely clear, devoid of all shadow. A spark of his old, wicked wit flared, but it was softened by a profound, newfound peace. I was just thinking, Granger, he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. I think I might change my name to Pierre. I've always felt I had a natural affinity for stubborn, bleating creatures. I should fit right in. The tension that had defined their relationship for years, the approach and repulsion, the doubt and the guilt, seemed to dissolve into the warm French morning. Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that drew the attention of the villagers, and for the first time since the war ended, it didn't feel like a defiance. It felt like happiness. Pierre, she teased, reaching out to straighten his now wrinkled collar. And what would that make me? Draco looked down at her, his expression softening into something so tender it made her heart ache. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he took her hand in the middle of the village square, ignoring the stares of the locals, and pressed a slow, lingering kiss to her knuckles. Ours, he whispered. It just makes us ours. The sun in Saint-Sulpice-des-Chèvres did not oppress like the artificial glow of the ministry's enchanted ceilings. It nourished. It fell in heavy, golden ribbons over the terrace of their cottage, baking the scent of wild rosemary and sun-warmed stone into the very air they breathed. 3 weeks had passed since the midnight train had evaporated into the mist, and for Hermione, the time felt both like a single, indrawn breath and a lifetime of shedding old skins. She sat on the low stone wall, watching Draco. He was currently engaged in a silent, intense standoff with a particularly recalcitrant silver-grey goat named Circe. The animal had decided that the gate to the lower pasture was merely a suggestion and was currently attempting to chew through the sleeve of Draco's linen shirt. a garment that was no longer the crisp, starched white of a London aristocrat, but was now rolled at the sleeves and stained with the honest, green-smelling dust of the valley. The Pierre joke had solidified into a local reality faster than Hermione had expected. The villagers, with their shrewd, kind eyes and complete lack of interest in British wizarding politics, had taken an immediate liking to the pale, tall boy with the hands of a pianist and the stubbornness of a mule. "She's winning, you know," Hermione called out, her voice dancing with suppressed amusement. Draco didn't turn around, but the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the wooden gatepost told her everything she needed to know. The tactile friction of the rough wood against his palms was a far cry from the cold, smooth handle of a wand, yet he hadn't reached for his hawthorn wood once that morning. "She is a demonic entity sent to test my sanity, Granger," Draco grumbled, though there was no heat in his voice. He finally managed to nudge the goat backward with his knee, latching the gate with a triumphant click. He turned to face Hermione, raking a hand through his hair. It was longer now, the white blonde strands wind-tossed and catching the light. "I am convinced Henri gave us this specific flock because he knew I'd find their lack of respect for lineage personally offensive. Maybe she just likes the taste of expensive fabric," Hermione teased, sliding off the wall. As she approached him, the atmosphere between them shifted. The light-heartedness of the morning didn't vanish, but it deepened, pulling taut like a silver wire. The magnetic pull was always there, a constant atmospheric pressure that governed their movements. Even in the middle of a sun-drenched field, the intensity of their connection felt like a private, localized storm. Draco's expression softened, the defensive lines of his face smoothing as he looked at her. But then, as it often did, the shadow flickered in his silver eyes. It was the approach and repulsion, the sudden, visceral warmth, followed by the sharp, internal cold of his own lingering doubt. He reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers hovering mere millimeters from her skin, before he hesitated. The phantom weight of his past, the rot in the foundation he still feared lived within him, made his hand tremble. He pulled back, turning his gaze toward the horizon where the mountains met the sky in a haze of indigo. "What?" Hermione asked softly, stepping into his space, refusing to let the chill take root. "It's too quiet," he murmured, his voice dropping into that gravelly, fractured register she knew so well. "Sometimes I wake up and I wait for the floor to fall out. I wait for the owls to bring the news that you've been stripped of your honors for staying here with me. I wait for the dream to break." This was the internal conflict that refused to die. Draco was a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the price to be paid, and he couldn't comprehend a world where happiness was free. "The owls don't know where we are, Draco," she said, her voice carrying an absolute grounded steel. She reached out and took his hand, forcing the tactile friction of her warmth against his freezing fingers. "And even if they did, let them come. I am not a prize to be lost. I am a woman who chose to be a goat farmer's wife in a village that doesn't care about my OWL scores." Draco's jaw tightened. "Pierre," he corrected, a weak attempt at his usual wit. "Pierre," she agreed, smiling, "who is currently being outsmarted by a goat." He let out a short, huffed laugh, but the tension in his shoulders didn't fully dissipate. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist with a sudden, desperate strength. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of sun and lavender. It was a silent, internal monologue of gratitude and terror, played out in the non-verbal intimacy of his grip. "You should come to the square," she whispered against his chest. "Henri said the initiation is tonight, the village feast. They want to formally accept us into the commune." Draco stiffened. The idea of a public ceremony, of being seen and judged by a community, even a kind one, sent a jolt of static through his frame. An initiation? What does that involve? Blood rituals, chanting. "Goat cheese and dancing, mostly," Hermione said, pulling back to look him in the eye. "And perhaps a bit of local magic. They want to tie our wards to the village's ancient stone. It means we'll be protected, truly protected." Draco stared at her, the internal war visible in the depths of his pupils. To be initiated was to belong. To belong was to stop running. And to stop running meant facing the fact that there was nowhere left to hide from his own heart. The evening in Saint-Sulpice was a sensory explosion. The village square had been transformed. Long wooden tables were laden with crusty loaves of bread, jars of golden honey, and wheels of the famous pungent cheese that smelled of the earth and the moon. Torches burned with a low magical flame that didn't smoke, casting a warm, flickering amber glow over the faces of the gathered residents. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the sharp floral notes of local wine. There was a low hum of conversation, punctuated by the rhythmic, melodic sound of a wooden flute and a small drum. Draco stood at the edge of the light, his back against a stone pillar. He had changed into a clean, dark blue tunic, the colour making his eyes look like polished mercury. He looked every inch the aristocrat, yet the way his hand kept reaching for the small carved wooden goat charm Henry had given him earlier showed his growing attachment to this strange, simple world. Hermione watched him from across the square. She was talking to some of the village women, her hands moving with an animated grace she hadn't possessed in London. She looked vibrant, her skin glowing in the torchlight, her vulnerability hidden beneath a layer of newfound strength. When the music shifted to a slower, deeper pulse, Henry stepped into the center of the square. He held a large, weathered stone bowl filled with clear spring water. "Tonight," Henry announced, his voice booming with a warmth that felt like a physical embrace, "we welcome two who have traveled far to find the silence, Pierre and Hermione." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Draco felt the magnetic pull of Hermione's gaze as she moved toward him, extending her hand. The tension in the air was palpable, a vibrating frequency that only they could hear. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his old fears whispering that he was an intruder in this sanctuary. But then he saw the steady, unwavering light in her eyes. He took her hand. The tactile friction of her palm against his was a spark that ignited his resolve. Together, they walked into the center of the square. The villagers formed a wide circle around them, their faces kind and expectant. There were no sneers here. No one looked at Draco's left arm, which remained hidden beneath his sleeve. Henri dipped a sprig of mountain thyme into the water and flicked it over them. The droplets felt like tiny, cool needles of light against their skin. "Do you promise to tend the land as it tends to you?" Henry asked. "I do," Hermione said, her voice clear and resonant. Draco swallowed the lump in his throat. He looked at the faces of the people who had given him a name that wasn't burdened by history. "I do," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "Then you are of Saint-Sulpice," Henri declared. He took a small silver knife and made a tiny symbolic nick on the trunk of the ancient olive tree that stood in the center of the square. He then pressed a piece of raw wool to the sap and handed it to Draco. "Place this in your hearth tonight. The house will know its masters." The crowd erupted into a joyous, rhythmic clapping. The music swelled, turning into a fast, spinning dance. In the chaos of the celebration, Draco pulled Hermione into the shadows of the olive tree. The atmospheric pressure between them had reached a fever pitch. The approach and repulsion had finally collapsed into a singular, undeniable need. He looked at her, his silver eyes burning with a raw, unadulterated intensity. "I think I'm starting to believe it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Believe what?" "That I can stay. That I don't have to be Pierre the farmer. I can just be Draco. And I can be happy." Hermione reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, her touch a grounding, sensual anchor. "You've always been allowed to be happy, Draco. You just had to leave the ghosts behind." He didn't pull away this time. He didn't retreat into the frost. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the scented night air. The distance between them was a memory. "I love you, Hermione," he said, the words a jagged, beautiful confession. She didn't answer with words. She pulled him down, her mouth seeking his in the dark beneath the olive tree. The kiss was not a gentle thing. It was a desperate, crashing collision of two souls who had finally found the shore. It tasted of wine, of salt, and of a future that was no longer a shadow. Draco's hands moved to her hair, his fingers tangling in the curls as he pulled her flush against him, his body a rigid, protective shield. The tactile friction of their lips, the heat of their breath, the overwhelming sense of belonging. It was the final resolution of the conflict. As they broke apart, breathless and dazed, the music of the village continued to pulse around them, a steady, joyous heartbeat. "Would you like me to continue with part 7? She whispered, a playful glint in her eyes. "Or do we have more goats to tend to?" Draco laughed, a real resonant sound that echoed through the square. "The goats can wait. Pierre is busy." The seasons in the valley changed with a subtle, graceful magic that had nothing to do with the flick of a wand. The intense, golden heat of late summer had mellowed into a crisp, amber-hued autumn. The air now carried the scent of drying hay, crushed grapes, and the cool, damp breath of the mountains. For Draco, the passage of time was no longer measured in the defensive cycles of his own guilt, but in the growth of the flock and the deepening resonance of the silence he shared with Hermione. They had become a fixture of Saint-Sulpice. The Pierre moniker had evolved into a term of endearment, a local shorthand for the man who had arrived with a storm in his eyes and had slowly learned to find peace in the rhythm of the soil. Draco's hands, once kept pristine and gloved against the world, were now calloused. He found a strange, grounding satisfaction in the tactile friction of the wooden pails, the rough wool of the goats, and the cool stone of their cottage walls. However, the emotional seesaw of his recovery was not a linear ascent. Even in paradise, the shadows of London occasionally found a way to bleed through the cracks. It happened on a Tuesday, a day of low-hanging mist and a biting chill that spoke of the coming winter. Draco was in the small stone shed behind the cottage, meticulously cleaning the shears. The sharp snip-snip of the metal blades was a repetitive, meditative sound that kept his mind from wandering. A sudden, sharp disturbance in the atmospheric pressure made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It wasn't the warm, earthy magic of the village. It was something sharp, cold, and distinctively British. He froze. His silver eyes darted to the doorway. A small, soot-stained owl, looking bedraggled and entirely out of place among the lush French greenery, sat on the stone ledge. It bore a heavy parchment envelope sealed with the unmistakable crimson wax of the British Ministry of Magic. The repulsion was instantaneous. Draco felt a violent surge of the old, icy static in his veins. The internal conflict he had spent months burying roared back to life. He stared at the letter as if it were a portkey to a prison cell. To open it was to acknowledge that the world they had fled still claimed ownership of them. To ignore it was to live in a lie that he feared was already crumbling. He didn't touch it. He stepped back, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the workbench. "Draco?" Hermione's voice was soft, but it cut through his spiraling thoughts like a blade. She was standing at the entrance of the shed, her hair damp from the mist, her cheeks flushed from a walk in the lower pastures. Her gaze fell on the owl, and then on the letter. The air in the shed grew heavy, the magnetic pull between them turning into a tense, vibrating wire. Hermione moved toward the ledge, her hand reaching out for the parchment. "Don't," Draco rasped. His voice was a ghost of the gravelly, broken tone he had used in London. "Leave it. Let it rot." Hermione paused, her fingers inches from the seal. She turned to look at him, her intelligent eyes searching his face, reading the raw, naked terror he tried so hard to mask with a facade of indifference. "We can't hide forever, Draco," she said gently. "If we don't face it, the fear of it will become our new cage." "We aren't hiding," he countered, his voice rising with a desperate, volatile energy. "We are living. That thing on the ledge is a ghost. It's the rot in the foundation trying to pull us back." Hermione didn't flinch. She took a step toward him, invading his personal space, her presence a warm, grounded interference against his cold panic. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the workbench. The tactile friction of her skin was the only thing keeping him from shattering. "It's just paper, Draco," she whispered. "It has no power here unless we give it some." She picked up the letter. With a sharp, decisive movement, she broke the seal. Draco watched her face as she read, his heart drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He expected her expression to change, to see the light fade from her eyes as the ministry demanded her return, or to see the pity return as they listed his remaining legal obligations. Instead, Hermione's brow furrowed in confusion, and then a small, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "What?" Draco demanded, his body coiled tight. "What does it say?" "It's an invitation," she said, shaking her head. "A formal request from the Department of International Magical Cooperation. They've finally noticed that the brightest witch of her age is missing, and they want to offer me a position as a liaison in France." She looked up at him, a mischievous glint in her eyes that mirrored the sparks of the hearth. It seems they don't want me back in London. They want me to stay right here and help build a bridge between our worlds. And as for you?" She paused, her gaze softening. "There's a small addendum, a private note from Shacklebolt. He says the files on the Malfoy estate have been closed, permanently. He calls it a recognition of voluntary exile." The silence that followed was profound. The atmospheric pressure that had been building since the owl arrived suddenly dissipated, leaving Draco feeling light and strangely hollow. The approach and repulsion he had lived with for years, the feeling that he was always one mistake away from losing everything, was being dismantled by a piece of parchment. He sank onto a wooden stool, his head dropping into his hands. The relief was not a sudden burst. It was a slow, agonizing thaw. Hermione moved between his knees, her hands resting on his shoulders. She didn't say anything, allowing him the space to process the fact that the cage door wasn't just open, it had been removed from its hinges. "So," he said after a long moment, his voice muffled by his palms, "I really am just a goat farmer. A very handsome, very grumpy goat farmer," Hermione teased, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. Draco looked up, his silver eyes clear and bright, the shadows finally receding into the corners of his mind. He reached out and pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, possessive warmth. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was a testament to how far they had come. There was no doubt here, no betrayal of trust, only the solid, undeniable reality of their shared life. "I suppose Pierre should start taking his liaison duties seriously," he murmured, his nose brushing against hers. "And how does he intend to do that?" "By ensuring the British liaison is thoroughly distracted from her paperwork." The witty, light-hearted tone of their interaction felt like a victory. They had faced the echo of their past and found that it no longer had the power to haunt them. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting a deep, violet light over the valley, they walked back to the cottage. The mist had cleared, revealing a sky full of early stars. Inside, the hearth was already warm. Draco moved to the kitchen, his movements fluid and confident. He poured 2 glasses of the local red wine, the dark liquid catching the firelight. He handed one to Hermione, their fingers brushing, a lingering, tactile contact that made the air between them hum with a familiar, magnetic energy. They stood by the window, looking out over the slumbering village. The sound of the goats in the lower pasture was a distant, comforting murmur. "Do you ever miss it?" Draco asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The noise? The importance?" Hermione turned to him, her expression serious. She reached up and traced the line of his jaw, her touch a sensual, grounding anchor. "I miss nothing that I didn't bring with me, Draco. Everything I ever truly wanted is in this room." The honesty in her voice was a physical impact. Draco set his glass down on the windowsill and turned to face her fully. The tension between them, once a source of pain, was now a beautiful, vibrant thing, a slow burn that had finally reached its peak. He didn't wait for her to move. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking the high curve of her cheekbones. The visceral alignment of their souls was absolute. "I used to think I was saving you by taking those tickets," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But the truth is, you're the one who saved me. You turned a ghost into a man." Hermione pulled him down. her mouth meeting his in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with the promise of 1,000 such nights. It wasn't the desperate, frantic kiss of the train or the square. It was the kiss of two people who knew they had the rest of their lives to explore each other. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm, rhythmic punctuation to the silence. In the heart of Saint-Sulpice, the Pierre and the liaison were gone, replaced by two people who had finally found their anywhere. The winter in Saint-Sulpice-des-Chèvres arrived not as a siege, but as a quiet silver benediction. A fine dusting of magical snow lay over the valley like powdered diamonds, softening the sharp edges of the stone walls and turning the ancient olive trees into shimmering sculptures of ice. Inside the cottage, the air was a thick, fragrant cocoon of cedarwood smoke, dried lavender, and the rich, velvety scent of the simmering stew on the hearth. This was the final shift. The emotional seesaw that had defined their journey, the frantic approach and the icy repulsion, had finally stilled, finding a perfect, vibrating equilibrium. Draco no longer looked at the door with the expectation of an intruder. He looked at it as a boundary that kept the world's noise out, rather than a barrier that kept his guilt in. Hermione sat by the fire, her legs tucked beneath her on the rug. She was cataloguing a collection of local mountain herbs, her movements fluid and peaceful. There was no frantic straightening of her cuffs, no nervous checking of the wards. She was entirely at home in her skin and in this space. Draco stood by the heavy oak table, his silhouette cast long and lean against the stone walls by the dancing firelight. He was working with a piece of soft, supple leather, crafting a new collar for Circe, who had finally accepted him as her primary caretaker, mostly through a series of tactical bribes involving dried apple slices. His hands, once the pale, idle hands of a Malfoy heir, were now steady and scarred, moving with a quiet confidence that was more aristocratic than any title he had ever held. He paused, his gaze drifting to Hermione. The magnetic pull was constant now, a low-frequency hum that anchored them to each other. He watched the way the firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. The visceral realization that this was his life, that he had not ruined her, but had instead found a way to thrive alongside her, hit him with a fresh, overwhelming wave of warmth. "You're staring, Pierre," she murmured without looking up, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I am observing the local wildlife," Draco countered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried a wealth of hidden tenderness. "I find this particular specimen remarkably resilient." Hermione looked up then, her eyes bright and filled with a depth of love that still occasionally made Draco's breath hitch. "Resilient? Is that the best you can do? I thought Malfoys were supposed to be masters of poetry and prose." "We are masters of many things, Granger," he said, setting down the leather and moving toward her. "But poetry fails when the reality is already perfect." He sank onto the rug beside her, the movement shedding the last of his restrained outer cold. He didn't hesitate to reach for her. He pulled her into his side, his arm a heavy, protective weight across her shoulders. The tactile friction of her wool sweater against his linen shirt was a grounding comfort. Tonight was the winter solstice, the night of the grand initiation for the newcomers who had stayed through the turning of the seasons. In Saint-Sulpice, This was the moment when the village magic truly recognized the bond of those who lived within its walls. "Are you ready?" Hermione asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "To stand in the cold and let Henri chant at us while goats watch?" "Surprisingly, yes," Draco said, kissing the top of her head. "It feels like the final piece of the puzzle, the last ward being set." The ceremony took place at the very peak of the village, at an ancient stone circle that predated even the Roman occupation. The villagers were gathered, their lanterns glowing like low-hanging stars against the dark, snowy slope. There was no music tonight, only the deep, resonant chime of a single silver bell that echoed through the crisp, still air. Henri stood in the center, his heavy sheepskin cloak dusted with white. He held a staff carved from the heart of an olive tree. "The year turns," Henry's voice boomed, carried by the mountain wind. "The shadows grow long, but the hearth stays warm. We bring those who have found their home into the heart of the stone." Draco and Hermione stepped forward together. Their fingers were interlaced, their grip so tight it felt as though their bones were merging. The atmospheric pressure at the center of the circle was intense, an ancient, raw magic that tasted of ozone and deep, cold earth. It was a magic that didn't care about blood status or war records. It only recognized the truth of the intent. Henri took a bowl of oil and marked their foreheads with a single shimmering line. "In the eyes of the valley, you are no longer strangers. You are the breath of the mountain and the blood of the vine." He then took a long, braided cord of white wool and silver thread. With a slow, deliberate grace, he bound their joined hands together. "The knot is tied," the villagers whispered in unison. At that moment, the ancient stones seemed to hum. A ripple of translucent, golden energy flared from the ground, sweeping over Draco and Hermione. It wasn't a violent impact, but a profound, cleansing warmth. Draco felt the last remaining shards of his internal guilt, the rot he had feared for so long, simply dissolve. It was as if the valley itself had looked into his soul and found it worthy of sanctuary. He looked at Hermione. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the golden glow of the magic. She looked like a goddess of the hearth, fierce and beautiful and entirely his. "It's done," she whispered, the words visible in the cold air. "It's just beginning," he replied. The ceremony ended with a communal feast in the square, but Draco and Hermione didn't stay long. They were eager to return to the quiet sanctuary of their cottage, to the world they had built out of nothing but hope and a pair of unmarked tickets. As they walked back through the soft, falling snow, Draco stopped her under the archway of the wisteria, which was now draped in a delicate lace of frost. The moonlight was so bright, it cast blue shadows across the white ground. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her cheeks. The non-verbal intimacy of the look they shared was a conversation that spanned years of pain and months of healing. The tension between them was no longer a source of conflict, but a beautiful, high-voltage connection that demanded a final, perfect resolution. "I used to wonder where the train was really supposed to go," Draco said, his voice thick with a raw, unshakable devotion. "I thought it was a trick, a way to lead us to another prison." "And now?" Hermione asked, her hands resting over his on her face. "Now I know," he whispered. "The destination wasn't a place. It was this. It was being able to look at you without feeling like I was stealing your light." He leaned down, his mouth finally meeting hers in a kiss that was the culmination of every approach and every repulsion they had ever endured. It was a kiss that tasted of home, of surrender, and of a future that was no longer a dream. Hermione pulled him closer, her fingers digging into the fabric of his coat, her whole body vibrating with the intensity of her response. This was the slow burn finally turning into a steady, eternal flame. They broke apart for breath, their foreheads resting against each other. Draco's eyes were bright with a sudden, mischievous spark. The witty, sharp-edged boy he had been, now tempered into a man who knew the value of a laugh. "I should probably tell you," he murmured against her lips. "Henri thinks we should increase the flock by 10 in the spring. Apparently, Pierre has a gift for goat whispering." Hermione laughed, a bright, joyous sound that echoed through the silent, snowy valley. "A gift? Or are you just as stubborn as they are?" "Both," he admitted, grinning. "Definitely both." He picked her up then, the movement sudden and effortless, and carried her over the threshold of their cottage. He kicked the heavy oak door shut, the lock engaging with a final resonant thud that signaled the end of their flight and the beginning of their peace. Inside, the fire was still burning bright. They didn't need words, and they certainly didn't need the world they had left behind. They had 2 tickets to anywhere, and they had chosen exactly where they were meant to be. The spring in Saint-Sulpice-des-Chèvres did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a riotous, fragrant explosion of life. The valley, once a silent study in winter silver, was now a vibrant tapestry of emerald grasses and the pale, ethereal purple of wild wisteria, heavy with dew. The air was no longer thin and biting. It was thick, humid, and intoxicating, carrying the scent of damp earth, blooming citrus, and the sharp, medicinal tang of the mountain herbs Hermione spent her mornings gathering. But beneath the beauty of the bloom, there was a frantic, grounding chaos. It was kidding season. The atmosphere in the cottage had shifted from the quiet, insular sanctuary of winter to a place of purposeful, exhausted labor. The rhythmic, mechanical peace of their exile had been replaced by the raw, visceral demands of nature. For Draco, this was the final crucible. The emotional seesaw that had once swung between his aristocratic pride and his paralyzing guilt had found a new axis. The survival of the small, shivering lives that were currently dropping into the hay of his barn. It was 3 a.m, a time when the world felt suspended in a heavy, indigo velvet. The rain was falling, not the oppressive vertical sheets of London, but a soft, rhythmic patter that sounded like 1,000 tiny heartbeats against the thatched roof of the birthing shed. Draco sat in the golden circle of a single enchanted lantern, his back against a post. His white linen shirt was a ruin of mud, birth fluids, and sweat. The sleeves rolled high past his elbows to reveal the corded tension in his forearms. On his lap lay a newborn kid, silver grey and barely larger than a house cat, its chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps. The tactile friction of the rough, dry burlap in his hands as he rubbed the kid's sides was the only sound in the shed. His long, elegant fingers that had once been destined to hold nothing more than a wand or a glass of vintage wine, were now moving with a desperate, practiced gentleness. He was breathing with the animal, his jaw locked in a grimace of focused intensity. He was no longer the Malfoy heir, nor was he merely a ghost in hiding. In this moment, Stripped of all titles and history, he was a man fighting to keep a spark of life from extinguishing in the dark. The heavy wooden door of the shed creaked open, admitting a gust of cool, blossom-scented air and the soft orange glow of a second lantern. Hermione stepped inside, her hair a wild, humid halo around her face, her burgundy cloak damp from the dash across the yard. She stopped when she saw him, her breath hitching in her throat. The show don't tell of his transformation was written in the curve of his shoulders. The rigid, defensive posture he had carried for years had vanished, replaced by a weary, soulful grace. He looked vulnerable, emotionally exposed, and more grounded than she had ever seen him. "How is she?" Hermione whispered, moving into his orbit. The magnetic pull was instantaneous, a warm, thick interference that settled over her skin as she knelt in the hay beside him. Draco didn't look up immediately. His focus remained on the small, shivering creature in his lap. "Stubborn," he rasped, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that resonated in the quiet shed. Like her mother, she won't take the milk, and her heart is flagging. The internal conflict was visible in the tightening of his eyes. He still feared his own hands. He still feared that the rot he believed lived in his blood would somehow poison the things he tried to save. Hermione didn't offer empty platitudes. She reached out, her fingers brushing the damp hair at the nape of his neck. The non-verbal intimacy of the touch acted as a grounding wire, siphoning off his rising panic. "She needs the heat, Draco. Your heat." "I'm freezing, Hermione," he murmured, a rare admission of physical frailty. "Then let me." She shifted closer, her body pressing against his side. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a shimmering amber liquid, a strengthening draught she had spent the previous evening brewing over their hearth. With a deft, gentle hand, she tipped a few drops into the kid's mouth. Then she wrapped her arms around both Draco and the animal, pulling them into the warmth of her cloak. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of wet wool and ozone. They sat there in the hay, a singular, tangled knot of humanity and nature. The atmospheric pressure in the shed narrowed until it was just the three of them, held together by a fragile thread of hope. Slowly, the kid gave a sudden, sharp bleat. It kicked a spindly silver leg against Draco's thigh and began to nuzzle into the warmth of his chest. Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime, a shuddering, jagged exhale that racked his entire frame. He leaned his head back against the post, his eyes closing as the kid began to breathe with a steady, rhythmic strength. "See," Hermione whispered, her lips brushing the sharp line of his jaw. "You didn't break it." Draco turned his head, his silver eyes opening to meet hers. The visceral alignment was absolute. In the dim lantern light, the storm in his gaze had finally cleared, leaving behind a profound, terrifyingly beautiful clarity. He reached up, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip, his touch no longer hesitant but certain. "I think," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum, "that Pierre might actually be better at this than Draco ever was at anything." Hermione smiled, the expression radiant and full of a quiet, hard-won triumph. Draco was a boy who thought the world was a battlefield. Pierre is a man who knows it's a garden. There's a difference. He pulled her closer, his hand tangling in her curls, drawing her face toward his. The tension between them, once a source of agonizing doubt, was now a vibrant, life-affirming static. He kissed her, a slow, deep and salt-tasting kiss that carried the weight of the night's struggle and the sweetness of the spring rain. When they finally broke apart, the kid gave another indignant bleat, squirming in their lap. Draco laughed, a real resonant sound that chased the last of the shadows from the corners of the shed. All right, he muttered to the animal, his wit returning with a sharp, playful edge. I saved your life. There's no need to be rude about the quality of the service. They spent the next hour in the hayloft, the kid finally settled with its mother in a nearby pen. The atmosphere was one of profound, post-adrenaline peace. They sat on a pile of fresh cedar shavings, sharing a thermos of tea that Hermione had brought. The steam rose in the cool air, carrying the scent of honey and bergamot. Henri says we'll have 10 more by the end of the week, Draco said, leaning his head back against the wooden slats. Can you handle 10 more? Draco looked at his hands, the dirt under his nails, the small scratches on his palms. He didn't look at them with the old Malfoy disdain. He looked at them with pride. I think I can handle anything, as long as I don't have to wear a tie ever again. Hermione laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. I think the Ministry would have an aneurysm if they saw the Death Eater heir now. Let them, Draco said, his tone final and surprisingly light. They don't own the name anymore. Pierre does. The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes when two people have truly run out of things to fear. They watched the blue light of dawn begin to bleed through the cracks in the shed walls, turning the mist outside into a shimmering, ethereal veil. The internal monologue that had haunted Draco for years, the one that told him he was ruining her, that he was a sinking ship, that he was an intruder in her light, had finally been silenced by the rhythmic bleating of the goats and the steady, unwavering warmth of the woman beside him. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain. He was a man in a barn in a hidden French valley, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. As the sun began to rise, casting long golden fingers over the valley, they stood up to walk back to the cottage. The rain had stopped, leaving the world sparkling and renewed. Draco paused at the door of the shed, looking back at the mother and her new kid. He reached out and touched the wood of the doorframe, his fingers tracing the grain. You know, he said, turning to Hermione with a sudden wicked glint in his eye. If we're going to be liaison to the French Ministry, I think we should insist on a goat-based tax system. It's far more honest than galleons. Hermione rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Let's just start with breakfast, Pierre. The liaison is hungry. They walked across the damp grass, their fingers interlaced, two figures moving toward a home that was no longer a refuge, but a kingdom. The journey from the rain-slicked platforms of London to the sun-drenched pastures of Saint-Sulpice was finally complete, and the only thing left to do was live. The midsummer air in Saint-Sulpice-des-Chèvres did not just carry the heat of the sun, it carried the pulse of the earth itself. It was a thick, heady atmosphere, saturated with the scent of wild jasmine, sun-baked stone, and the sweet, fermented promise of the season's first cherries. The valley was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a living, breathing extension of their own shared heartbeat. For Draco, the transition from the frantic uncertainty of spring to the golden stillness of midsummer had been a silent internal revolution. The emotional seesaw had finally come to rest. The boy who had fled London with a pocketful of stolen magic and a soul weighed down by iron-cold guilt had been replaced by a man whose strength was drawn from the soil. The Pierre identity was no longer a costume he wore to hide from his past. It was the skin he had grown into. He stood on the small stone terrace of their cottage, the late afternoon sun casting long amber shadows across the valley floor. He was dressed in a tunic of deep midnight blue linen, a gift from the village weaver, and his white blonde hair, now longer and lightened by the sun, was pushed back from a face that had lost its haunted, hollow, sharp edges. He looked out over his flock, watching the silver-grey goats graze peacefully in the lower pasture. A soft, rhythmic rustle of parchment behind him made him turn. On the butcher block table sat a single weathered envelope. It had arrived that morning, not by a ministry owl, but by a common, nondescript bird that had flown away as soon as the letter was delivered. The seal was not crimson wax, but a simple, elegant press of green. It was from Narcissa, the internal conflict that would have paralyzed him a year ago, the fear of his mother's disappointment, the weight of the Malfoy legacy, did not rise. Instead, he felt a strange, detached clarity. He had already read the letter. It contained no demands, no pleas for him to return to a world of cold marble and bitter tea. It was a silent blessing, a mother's recognition that her son was finally breathing air that didn't taste of ash. Hermione stepped out onto the terrace, her presence a sudden, warm interference in his thoughts. She was wearing a dress of simple, flowing cream-coloured silk, her curls caught back with a sprig of fresh lavender. She looked like the very spirit of the valley, intelligent, vibrant, and utterly untethered from the ghosts of her former life. She saw the letter in his hand. The magnetic pull between them tightened, the atmospheric pressure dropping as they shared a moment of profound, non-verbal understanding. "Draco?" she asked, her voice a low melodic hum. He didn't answer with words. He walked to the small stone hearth built into the terrace wall, where a small fire was kept to ward off the evening mountain chill. With a slow, deliberate movement, he dropped the letter into the flames. The tactile friction of the paper as it caught fire, the way the green wax melted into the ash, was the final resolution. The rot in the foundation was gone. He was not a Malfoy heir in exile. He was Pierre, and he was home. "She's happy, Hermione," he said, turning back to her. His silver eyes were clear, the frost entirely replaced by a deep, liquid warmth. "She just wanted me to know that she's finally at peace with the silence." Hermione moved into his space, her hands sliding up his chest to rest on his shoulders. The non-verbal intimacy of the gesture was a testament to the months of healing they had navigated together. "Then, the silence is truly ours now." "Always," he whispered. The village of Saint-Sulpice was already beginning to glow as the sun dipped behind the indigo peaks. Hundreds of magical lanterns, enchanted to float just above the cobblestones, were being released. They drifted like slow-moving fireflies, casting a warm, flickering amber light over the square where the midsummer festival was reaching its peak. The atmosphere in the village was electric. The scent of roasted lamb, honeyed wine, and wood smoke filled the air. There was no shadow of the past here, no prying eyes or whispered judgments. To the people of Saint-Sulpice, This was simply the night they celebrated the sun and the bonds that tied the community together. As they walked down toward the square, hand in hand, the villagers greeted them with nods of genuine affection. Draco, Pierre, responded with a quiet, confident grace that was entirely his own. He was no longer a pariah. He was the man who had saved the silver goats in the spring, the man who had learned the language of the mountains. Henri stood by the ancient olive tree, which had been draped in hundreds of white silk ribbons that fluttered in the warm night breeze. The music had begun. A fast, rhythmic pulse of wooden flutes and drums that made the very stones of the square seem to vibrate. "It is time," Henri announced, his voice a rich, grounding rumble that cut through the music. The midsummer rite was not a wedding in the British sense. There was no contract, no formal exchange of gold, no ministry official to record the union. It was a hand-fasting of the soul, a promise made to the earth and to each other. Draco and Hermione stepped into the center of the circle formed by the villagers. The atmospheric pressure was intense, a vibrant, localized static that made the hairs on Draco's arms stand on end. He looked at Hermione, her face illuminated by the golden lantern light, and felt a surge of devotion so profound it felt like a physical impact. Henri took a long, braided cord made of silver thread and blue wool. "Tonight, we tie the knot that the wind cannot unravel," he said. He began to wrap the cord around their joined hands. The tactile friction of the wool and silver against his skin was a sharp, grounding sensation. As Henri spoke the ancient, simple words of the rite, Draco felt the magic of the valley rising to meet them, a warm, pulsing energy that recognized them as two halves of a whole. "I am yours," Draco whispered, his voice a gravelly, raw confession that only she could hear. In the light and in the silence. "I am yours," Hermione echoed, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Wherever the train stops." The crowd erupted into cheers as the cord was knotted. The music swelled into a joyous, spinning melody. In the chaos of the celebration, Draco pulled Hermione away from the center of the square, leading her toward the deep, scented shadows beneath the ancient wisteria that hung from the village hall. The distance between them vanished. The magnetic pull that had governed their entire relationship, the approach and the repulsion, the tension and the need, finally reached its absolute peak. He didn't hesitate. He cupped her face in his hands, his fingers tangling in her lavender-scented curls, and pulled her down into a kiss. It was a kiss that contained everything. The rain-slicked platforms of London, the rhythmic clatter of the midnight train, the cold nights in the barn, and the golden mornings on the terrace. It was slow, deep, and filled with a visceral, grounding heat. It was the kiss of two people who had finally stopped running. Hermione clung to him, her hands gripping the midnight blue linen of his tunic, her mouth meeting his with a fierce, unwavering certainty. The slow burn had become a permanent flame, a source of light that would never be extinguished. They broke apart for a moment, breathless and dazed, the golden light of the lanterns dancing in their eyes. "I think," Draco murmured, his nose brushing against hers, his wit returning with a soft, affectionate edge, "that the village liaison is remarkably beautiful tonight. I may have to neglect my goat-tending duties to pay her proper attention." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that was the true music of the valley. I think the liaison would find that highly acceptable, Pierre. They stood together under the wisteria, watching the villagers dance, watching the lanterns drift toward the stars. They were no longer the pariahs of a war-torn world. They were the heart of a village they had helped to heal. The story that had begun with 2 tickets to anywhere had ended with a single, unshakable truth. They were home. The night deepened, the silver moon rising high above the mountains, casting its cool, protective light over the valley of Saint-Sulpice. And there, in the quiet, fragrant dark, the man who had been Draco Malfoy and the woman who had changed his world stayed together, their hearts beating in perfect, eternal sync with the magic of the land.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end. This story is special. It is not just about magic or train, it is about the courage to leave a world that hurts you. Draco and Hermione found their peace. They stopped being what people wanted them to be. They became who they truly were. Maybe some of you remember another story, the one about Malfoy's Book of Rules. If you do, I hope you smiled at the reference. I really enjoyed writing about Pierre again. He finally got his wish. He finally became a god farmer. And honestly, I think he is much happier with gods than with politics. We all have our own London. We all have things that weight us down. I hope this story gives you a little bit of hope. Maybe your anywhere is closer than you think. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling this journey with me. Until next time, stay magical.